Today's daf is daf Yud Aleph, and we begin with Ela Hainu Taima Dirabonon, where we left off yesterday, and we're trying to figure out why the Rabbanon arrive at the conclusion that an Asham, a korban Asham, is not possible if its blood, if the dam of the korban is brought into the Heichel, highly Taima Dirabonon, Tiyoma Kra Domah. And the Torah says, Dama with regard to chatos, Dama shel zu, the extra hay teaches you a mute, v'lo Dama shel acher. So there's no other korban other than chatos that becomes possible as a result of the fact that he brought the dam into the heichel, the idach. But Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. And how do we explain Rabbi Eliezer? After all, it does say Dama, which sounds like a mute, Dama v'lo b'sara, that if the meat of the korban was brought into the heichal, it doesn't passel the korban, even though if the dam was brought into the heichal, it would passel the korban. So that even in the case of chatos, where the Torah says dama, it's coming to exclude b'sara, the idach. And what about the Rabbanon? How do they know that the pasuk excludes basar? Dam dama. They have a drasha of dam dama, the extra hay, and therefore dam teaches me v'lo basar, and dama teaches me, and not the basar, and not the dam of any other korban of the idach. What about Rabbi Eliezer? Dam lo dar. She doesn't darshan the extra hay of dama because the Torah had to mention dam in order to exclude basar, and therefore the common usage would be dama. So the Gemara now questions whether Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah that an asham, if he brought it shalol lishma as possible, bishleim rabbanon, di amri asham sheshchato shalol lishmo kasher, hainu de iskash mincha lechatos, mincha li asham. As we'll soon see in the Brisa, there is a hekesh both between mincha and chatos and mincha and asham. And according to Rabbanu, we can justify the need for these two hekesh. Tesanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kodesh Kadoshim Hu Kachatos V'Cha'asham. So with regard to a korban mincha, the Torah calls it a Kodesh Kadoshim, and it's compared to both Chatos and Asham. Says Rabbi Shimon, why the double equation, the analogy? Minchas chote harei kechatos. We're going to split up mincha into two categories. There's a mincha of a chote. For example, in the case of a korban olah v'yored, he violated those special isurim, and he doesn't have the financial wherewithal to bring neither an animal nor an oaf. He brings a mincha. And hareu kechatos. What is that? The significance of equating the minchas chote to a chatos? Because kmitza, in the case of a mincha, is equivalent to zrika in the case of a zevach. Leficha kmatza shelo lishma psula. So just like in the case of shchita of a korban chata shelo lishma, it becomes possible, so too mincha, by virtue of the fact that it is equated with a chatas, if the kmitza was done shalol lishma, then it passes the mincha. But minchas nedava, that's a different category of a korban mincha. Harei hi ke'asham. And if an asham was brought shalol lishma, it's kosher. So too, a minchas nedava, by virtue of its equation to an asham, leficha kamotza shalol lishma kshera. So all this makes sense if we assume that a korban asham, if he brought it shalol lishma, it's kshera. That's the shita of the Rabbanan, El Rabbi Eliezer. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that even an asham has a psul of shalol lishma, the korban is pasul, is lamai hilchasa iskash mincha lechatos mincha liyasham. what's the purpose of this double comparison? I mean, how could you derive any conclusions by comparing a mincha to a chatos and yet comparing it to an asham? Because in the case of Rabbi Eliezer, both chatos and asham shalol lishma is possible. So what would be a reason to equate mincha to both chatos and asham? There's no difference between a chatos and asham according to Rabbi Eliezer, because both are possible shalol lishma. And the Gemara answers l'chi idach to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Eliezer will have to justify the equation of mincha to both chatos and asham in order to support Rabbi Shimon's other presentation. This now we learned in a Mishnah. This Mishnah is going to be in Menachos on Daf Chavav, that shelo b'kli shores psula. Right, so the korban mincha is brought with all its ingredients first in one kli shores, and then the kvitza is done in a second kli shores. And the Rabbanan hold that in the absence of a second kli shores, to add another level of kedusha to the kometz mincha, then the mincha is possible. But Rabbi Shimon Machshir, Rabbi Shimon said, since it has the original kiddush before the kmitza, when everything was mixed together, therefore the fact that it's brought on the mizbeach biyad, if the kmitza was done biyad without a kli sharis, it's kosher. The Omer of Yehuda Brei Reb Chia, my timer, the Rabbi Shimon, why does he come to the conclusion that you can do an avodas hakmitza biyad without a kli sharis? My time, Reb Shimon, Omer Kodesh Kadoshim Hi Kechatos V'Cha'osham. So now we said there's a double equation between the mincha and chatos, the mincha and asham. Now, what's the purpose of this double equation? And the answer is that because a mincha could be brought in two different ways, according to Reb Shimon, because bali ovta v'yad ovta v'yamin kechatos, he can offer the karban mincha, meaning the kmitza, with his hand without a kli sharis, but now the avoda with his hand has to be done biyamin like a chatos. And the dam of a chatos, when it's applied by the kohen to the mizbeach, he has to use the finger of his right hand. And therefore, if the kohen, in the case of kmitza, wants to place it on the mizbeach with his hand, he's got to use his right hand. And bekli, if the kohen decides that he'll bring the kmitza onto mizbeach in the normal accepted way, namely with a kli sharis, ovda v'smol ka'asham. Now, we have to understand the equation to asham, because in the case of the asham, the dam is thrown onto the mizbeach from a kli sharis, which would be held, according to Shimon, even in the left hand of the kohen. So although Zrika v'chatos requires, even according to Reb Shimon, the right hand of the Kohen, but Zrika of other korbanos, for example, in this case of a chatos, I'm sorry, in this case of kmitza or an osham, he can use his left hand. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, Reb Shimon, hi krab, mapikle lahachi, are you telling me that this is what Reb Shimon does with kechatos ke'asham? I'm sorry, when it says mincha, kodesh kadoshim kechatos ke'asham, then he needs it for both if the avoda is biyad or the avoda is b'kli shares. And the Gemara says that how then could Rabbi Shimon – in the previous brisa, derive the conclusion that kmitza shelo lishma in the case of a minchas chote is psul, in the case of minchas nedova ke'asham, and it's kosher. So therefore, Reb Shimon seems to be using this double equation for two different halachas. So the Gemara answers, Ika krol Reb Yehuda, etc., etc. So the main purpose of the pasuk is to teach us that there are two methods by which the kmitza can be brought on the mizbeach, and depending on which method he uses, whether it's that of Osham or that of Chatas, will decide which hand he would use. What about the fact that a mincha shelo lishma is psula, that is going to be derived from taima achrinahu, not based on this pasuk, but rather from another argument, chatos, taima mai. Why is it that shelo lishma is pasul chatos, tichsiv behu, who meaning that it has to be brought lishma, is minchas chote nami, ksiv behu. We also have a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Hey with regard to a korban minchas chote, and there too the Torah uses the word hu. It says ve'hevi'ah el hakohen v'kamatz hakohen mimeno malo kumtzo es azkaroso v'hiktir hamizbecha al ish Hashem chatos hu. So it means that in the case of mincha, if you brought the mincha shelo lishma, then it's possible because of the word hu, and that's in the parsha of Minchas Chote. Ul the Rabbanon don't have a halacha of Osham Kechatos to exclude Shelo Lishma, to pasel Shelo Lishma. So Lamai Hilchsa Iskish Osham Lechatos. What did the Rabbanon do with the hekesh between Osham and Chatos? If according to the Rabbanon, if he brought the Osham Shelo Lishma, it's kosher. Lo Melacha Ma Chatos Tuna Smichaf Osham Toun Smicha. Now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah quotes a machlokes between the Tanakama and Yosef ben Choni, who says Hanishchotim, which means that if a person shechts a korban during the 14th of Nisan for the sake of a chatos, then it's possible. So any korban that's brought for the sake of Pesach, if it's during its appropriate time, which means the 14th of Nisan, then it's possible. Or if it's brought for the sake of Chatas any time of the year, it's possible. Right? In a certain sense, Yossi ben Choni is operating with a kind of a reciprocity. That just like if you bring a Chatas for the purpose of another korban, it's possible. So too, if you bring another korban for the sake of Chatas, it's possible. And just like if you bring a Pesach for the sake of another korban, it's possible. So too, if another korban is brought for the sake of Pesach, at least in its specified time in Nisan, 14th of Nisan, then it's possible. Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Yossi ben Choni, Rabbi Eliezer, Amru Dover Echad. So in other words, Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Yochanan's understanding, holds like Yossi ben Choni, that any korban that was brought for the sake of Chatos any time of the year is possible, just like if a korban was brought for a Chatos if a chatas was brought for another korban, it's possible. So too, if another korban is brought for the sake of chatas, it's possible. And also, if another korban was brought for the sake of Pesach, it's possible. But Rabba Omar, ba'acherim l'shem chatas pligi, that there is a machlokas between Yosef ben Choni and Rabbi Eliezer with regard to another korban that was brought for the sake of chatas. So it means that according to Rabbah, if a korban was brought for the sake of chatas, it's kosher. Whereas according to Yosef ben Choni, any korban that's brought for the sake of a chatas is possible. The Sanya. Now here we're going to bring a brisa that quotes Rabbi Eliezer, and then there's going to be a machlok between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbah as to how to interpret the shita of Rabbi Eliezer in this brisa. The Sanya, HaPesach sha'ov rosh naso. So the Pesach after its first year can no longer be brought as a korban Pesach, but rather it's considered a korban shlamim. Shachto b'zmano lishmo. If he shechted this Pesach, which now has the din of shlomim, on the 14th of Nisan, and he shechted it lishmo, which means here in this case l'shem shlomim, v'chein hashochet acherim l'shem Pesach b'zmano. If any other korban was brought on the 14th of Nisan for the sake of Pesach, Rabbi Eliezer posil, Rabbi Yeshua machshir. So Rabbi Eliezer posil, because in the case of korban Pesach, Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Yosef ben Choni that any korban that's brought for the sake of Pesach in its specified time, meaning on the 14th of Nisan, is possible. Now, what about a korban that's brought for the sake of chatos? That we don't know yet, but we'll see it later on. Or Rabbi Yeshua, im b'shar yemos hashana, she'eno kosher lishmo. Right? If a Pesach was shechted lishmo for the sake of a Pesach during the period of the entire year, the Pesach becomes possible, and acherim ksherim lishmo, if another korban was brought for the sake of a Pesach, is bismano hu kosher lishmo. So again, if another korban was shechted for the sake of a Pesach, then it's kosher. Bismano shu kosher lishmo, eno din sheyuchsheru acherim lishmo. Right, so how much more so if it's the 14th of Nisan, which is Zman Pesach, and Yishechted L'Shmo is kosher, that's exactly what you have to do, then isn't it illogical that another korban that was brought for the sake of Pesach knows what Rabbi Yeshua is trying to demonstrate is that shechting the Pesach in its proper time is less of a problem than shechting it during the rest of the year. It is more likely for a korban that's associated with the Pesach to be valid on the 14th than during the rest of the year. And therefore, if other offerings, other karbonos are valid during the rest of the year when they are shechted for the sake of a Pesach, then they would certainly be valid when they were shechted for the sake of a Pesach on the 14th. Omer lo Rabbi Eliezer, o chiluf hadvarim. Why don't we apply the exact opposite logic and come to the exact opposite conclusion that a Pesach is valid on the 14th, even if it was shechted shalol lishma. Umayim b'shar yemos hashana she'eno kosher lishmo kosher hu l'shem acherim is bismano shu kosher lishmo in adin sheyuchshal l'shem acherim v'yuchshar pesach bar basar shalol lishmo. Based on your logic, when it comes to an impossible position, Chenat HaOmer, can you maintain that position that if you shecht a carbon Pesach on 14th, Shalol Lishma, it's going to be kosher? And Rabbi Eliezer now shows the flaw in Rabbi Shu's argument. Mali huchshur acherim v'shar yemos hashana lishmo. Other karbonos, if they were shechted for the sake of the Pesach during the entire year, is huchsheru, they're kosher. Shekenu kosher l'shem acherim, because the Pesach was shechted for the sake of other karbonos, it's kosher, because we're talking b'shayim hashana. The yuchsheru acherim bizmano l'shmo. Then another carbon, during the Zman of the carbon Pesach, if it was shechted another carbon for the sake of a Pesach, it should become kosher, shekenu pasul l'shem acherim, because the pasuk, the Pesach, if it was shechted for the sake of another carbon, bismano is pasul. So carbon is kosher when it was shechted for the sake of the Pesach during the rest of the year, because the Pesach itself would be kosher if it was shechted for the sake of another carbon during the rest of the year. But on the 14th, when the Pesach is possible if it was shechted for the sake of another carbon, then any other karbonos that was shechted for the sake of a Pesach should be possible. So Rabbi Yochanan, from this argument that Rabbi Eliezer invalidates, he apostles a carbon that is shechted for the sake of a chatos, because a chatos is always possible when it was shechted for the sake of another offering. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Eliezer based his ruling about the Pesach on the fact that the Pesach is invalid. It's possible when it was shechted shalol lishma. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan states that Rabbi Eliezer would apply the same logic to chatos, which is always possible when it was shechted shalol lishma. So any carbon that was shechted for the sake of a chatos is possible any time during the year. Rabbah disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer because of a revised exposition stated by Rabbi Eliezer later in this brisa. And now in the next part of the brisa, Rabbi Yeshua's pircha on Rabbi Eliezer is quoted, Amalo Rabbi Yeshua im kain horata koach pesach v'nasata koach b'shlamim. Right? You've, so to speak, weakened the strength of the Pesach, and you gave additional strength to shlamim. Now, Pesach is more chomer than a shlamim. Right? For example, if a Pesach was shechted for the purpose of another carbon, it's possible, which is not true for shlamim. And at this point, Rabbi Eliezer apparently drops his argument, comes up with another argument. Chazer Rabbi Eliezer v'dono din acher matzinu moser Pesach b'shlamim. Right? He had designated a carbon for a Pesach, then he lost it. Now he found it after he brought the substitute carbon. And what do we do with this moser Pesach? We bring it as a shlamim. V'yein moser shlamim ba Pesach. But if you had, let's say, a moser of shlamim, you designated this carbon as a shlamim, then you lost it, found another one, brought it, and now you found the original shlamim. It cannot be brought as a Pesach. Uma Pesach shemos soro ba shlamim. A moser Pesach could be brought as shlamim shechato bizmano l'shum shlamim pasul. And if somebody shechted a carbon at the time of the carbon Pesach, for the sake of a shlamim, then the carbon is possible because bismano it has to be brought as a carbon Pesach. Is shlamim she'ein mosaron ba Pesach. If you have a mosar shlamim, it cannot be brought as a Pesach. Im shchatam l'shem Pesach bismano in a din psulin.